everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics. Today, this is going to be an interesting one. Our first ever former Senator Tom Daschle. How are you today?
I'm well, Joe. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Joined by Charlie Panfil as well from the Daschle Group. Thanks, Charlie, for joining us as well.
Thanks for having me on, Joe.
Absolutely. So I want to first give folks a little bit of background on you, Senator Daschle. So I know you're a veteran yourself. Can you talk briefly about your service?
Well, I served 3 years in the Air Force during the Vietnam era. I didn't serve in Vietnam. I was an intelligence officer at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. I left in 1972, long time ago, and then joined Senator Jim Abarisk in the Senate, and then ran for the House in 1978, and ran for the Senate in 87, and became Democratic leader in 94. Served until 2005, and that's when I left the Senate.
That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing all that. It's great background. And just to set the stage, Charlie, can you share a little bit about your background too?
Yeah, sure thing. This summer will be 4 years at the Daschle Group for me. Did undergrad and my master's degree at GW, including my program's first healthcare thesis on psychedelic medicine, which was definitely an interesting submission to my professors, but they ended up being really interested. And I've been working on psychedelic issues with Senator Daschle for about 2 years this August.
Fantastic. So I'm curious about, before we introduce the psychedelic topic, let's talk about some of the issues at hand. So I'm friendly with a number of veterans. They're happy with the progress over the last few years, but obviously we need to keep working on this and keep providing better care. But how do we want to share with the audience our current status around veterans healthcare? I mean, just to, folks may not have all that much data, perhaps. Some do. But how do you all like to talk about that?
Well, I think in some ways the Veterans Administration is at the cutting edge of a lot of these issues, almost out of necessity, in part because so many veterans have experienced challenges, both mentally and physically, that I think our country has been slow to respond to. And the VA has characteristically also been slow to respond to many of them. I served for 26 years on the Veterans Committees in both the House and the Senate. And so I can attest to both the fact that the VA has really kind of led the way in some ways, but I think in large measure has been dragged kicking and screaming into a realization that they need to address these issues. I look back with some satisfaction on some of the progress we've made, but we have a long way to go. And what is true in the VA is true in the nation, and for that matter, worldwide. So I think that's where you start. You realize that the VA is really in a unique position to help not only our veterans, but to all people who are experiencing the challenges around mental illness especially.
Yeah. Charlie, anything you'd like to add maybe?
Yeah, I think, we saw the PACT Act recently pass, and I think the investments in that we'll see continue to play out. The funding from the PACT Act is currently in the VA budget. That's, more focused on cancers and exposure to toxic burn pits. But, it's our greatest investment in veterans healthcare in a very long time. Also took a lot of political capital to get over the finish line. But we'll hopefully get good outcomes out of that. And hopefully some of the PACT Act money, now that it'll be focused on those other issues that the entire VA research budget was focused on, will continue to be able to use other VA budget resources for things like psychedelic-assisted therapy research, which is receiving some funding now, but doesn't necessarily have like a dedicated bucket of money every year, which we would obviously like to see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And can we talk about how important the VA is for our veterans, maybe?
Well, there really isn't anybody that is more responsible for the care of our veterans than the Veterans Administration. I have the good fortune in some ways to have the current Veterans Administrator who served in my office in the Senate for many years and was Chief of Staff to President Obama, Dennis McDonough. And I give him great credit for the leadership he's shown. But I think he inherited somewhat of an intransigent bureaucracy, and one that's kind of slow to act. I saw that firsthand in my very first experience on the Veterans Affairs Committee. I was the first Vietnam era veteran on the committee, and one of the two areas that I focused on extensively in the early years of my service on the committee was Agent Orange and PTSD. And in both cases, we had most of the veterans organizations opposed to any federal acknowledgement of the problem or willingness to engage in the problem or help address veterans who were experiencing the problem. Both PTSD and Agent Orange have long and very agonizing histories with regard to the legislative process and the progress we made. But I saw firsthand just what opportunities the VA could offer, but yet what intransigence oftentimes occurred, in part because of politics, in part because of bureaucracy, and in part because of lack of a recognition that many of these new wars have brought new wounds that we weren't ready to recognize.
I think as well, we talk a lot about the VA in the context of mental health, but veterans go to the VA and VA centers for all sorts of healthcare needs, even if it's just to get their flu shot, for example, right? So, a strong VA means strong care and wraparound services for our veterans. Also, it's supposed to be the resource for folks if they're having issues with homelessness, for example, which I know is another issue that our veterans face that is also really tied into addiction and mental health. So we need as strong a VA as possible. And kind of off of what Senator Daschle said too, when we saw the announcement of psychedelic-assisted therapy research in January from the VA, while obviously that was met with a lot of appreciation, there was also a level of frustration there. For years, researchers and advocates have heard that VA was not allowed to research Schedule I drugs. That applied to both psychedelics and cannabis, and that there would have needed to be some big change, whether at the regulatory or legislative level, for that to happen. So they kind of hid behind Schedule I, and then we saw that change happen with no new bill passed in Congress or no new regulation made. And so again, while we're very appreciative of the VA announcement, there is also definitely within the veteran community some frustration there as well. And our hope too is that the takeaways and the data from the research at VA helps the entire country and helps set the stage for broader access to this care, not just for the veteran population. That's the main population that we work with through the Veteran Mental Health Leadership Coalition. But veterans are about 4% of the American population. There are a lot of people who on day one of approval of these therapies will be eligible and need that help.
Yeah, thank you for that. Senator Daschle, can you describe how the psychedelic topic came on your radar?
Well, it's interesting. The psychedelic topic came on my radar first in a totally different set of circumstances than the ones we're facing now. I served in the House and the Senate at a time when the war on drugs was really at its peak, and legislators like me heard over and over from experts that substances like MDMA and psilocybin were dangerous, addictive drugs that put public safety and health at risk. And so that's really what the mentality was for decades. And of course, that all has to do with Schedule I and the act that's now been on the books for about 50 years. And so I regret really that as a result of the fact that it has been a Schedule I perception for so long and actually a legal requirement, we've had limited research. We've had limited understanding of what these substances can provide. But things are gradually changing, and I'm very encouraged that they are. Research has improved. Once you hear the data or the stories and read the data and find out how many lives have been saved and what a consequence that some of these research projects has already shown for people's lives and their health, you can't help but re-examine, which is what happened to me, I guess, maybe about 15 years ago. And over time, we've become real advocates, in part because we've seen the results, we've seen the research, we've seen the data, and we now believe it's really time for us to to move forward and to enhance the research and do even more to better understand how these drugs could be helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, the drug war has been a really complicated thing, and I hope we can move towards a science-based drug policy eventually. Um, have you heard? This is off script a little bit, but this is a big topic in the psychedelic research community. DEA is regularly trying to schedule compounds that have no illicit use, and that are very interesting to researchers for potential pharmaceutical development. One of which is a radical anti-inflammatory DOI, which we think could improve pain conditions radically worldwide. Has that one come on your radar, or that kind of like a regular scheduling of new compounds?
I think I'll defer to Charlie, but I think your question raises the larger issue, which is that's really what we want to do by descheduling, is because you really are constrained. Even if you're talking about Schedule 3 now, you're still constrained. And that constraint has really undermined the research and undermined the evaluation of the tremendous potential that exists across the board. And I really hope that at some point the American people will have more of an opportunity to impress upon members of Congress and whatever administration is serving in the White House that the time has come for us to recognize what a failure the war on drugs was, and how much it set us back, and how many millions and millions of people were adversely affected by this, not only through incarceration, but through the lack of good research that could have saved lives and improved the health of millions of others. But Charlie, I'll turn it over to you.
I think with DOI and DOC, it kind of, Joe, kind of goes back to what you're saying. We should have science-based drug policy. One of the ways that we look at it is, you have FDA as a public health arm, but DEA is not really a public health agency. It's more of a law enforcement agency, is like the way that we look at it. And when it comes to scheduling, or, when it comes to rescheduling things that are already Schedule 1 or these new schedulings, I think what we continue to find frustrating is the lack of communication and agreement between DEA and FDA, right? I think if you ask FDA, we already know that some of these drugs have breakthrough therapy designations from FDA, right? But if we go and look at things like DOI or DOC, and using DOI as the example, right? We have a drug that we know has these anti-inflammatory properties. There is no current use case for illicit activity. And so from both a public health and a law enforcement perspective, it's really, in our opinion, out of bounds for DEA to decide to need to put this as likely a Schedule 1 drug. That's what our assumption is, what they'll go for. And I think without those real world use cases, I think it's very hard, or it should be very hard at least, for DEA to make that scheduling decision, especially when we talk about things like chronic pain. Right, that is one of the conditions at the root of the opioid crisis, right? Is you had people who were prescribed essentially pharmaceutical heroin for chronic pain, and we now have an opportunity for those folks to be off a drug like that and take something like DOI instead, and we're instead going to use the same war on drugs mentality. I think mainly because for a lot of folks that are at DEA, that's the kind of mindset they're entrenched in, versus what we see at FDA and Congress or in the White House. With, for example, Joe Biden, Barack Obama are going to be two of the most progressive presidents on drug policy, but they don't have a DEA to match that, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks for that, Charlie. And to bring this into a larger economic context, I think there's so many people out of work as a result of this, and out of helping our country together and the world, that it's a gigantic economic opportunity to get these people back into our country in a really helpful, positive way. So yeah, big one there.
Definitely. I think, part of that is also when we work with a lot of folks who've gone through this kind of therapy, not only was their personal, like themselves, weren't they, we hear saved a lot as kind of a description of how they felt, But we also hear a lot about, their interpersonal relationships, their family, their friends, their coworkers, and how those relationships were able to be kind of put back on track or improved. Or, I've talked to especially veterans who, because of their PTSD and other mental health conditions, they had drug use problems, they were an alcoholic or things like that, that may have led to a divorce or not being around their kids as often. And then we're able to go through this therapy and get back to family life and get back to a productive work life. And so as much as there is an economic benefit there, I think some of those family benefits are also a public health and an economic benefit, as well as, we have folks that are, back to living a quote unquote normal life. And I think what frustrates us more than anything else is these are folks who served our country that can't get the healthcare they need in the United States, right? They're going overseas, they're going to other countries, especially as we hear from a lot of politicians how much they don't like Mexico, or they don't like some of these other countries. But that's where our veterans go to get the healthcare that they need. And so, our focus is really how do we bring that care here to the United States, whether it's in VA, whether it's through commercial insurance, and academic institutions and hospitals, like for example out in Utah, and get folks back on track and kind of heal what we hear a lot also, the term moral injury. So heal that moral injury that a lot of folks have faced through their service or outside of the veteran population. We think about, for example, folks who've survived abusive relationships and sexual violence who have PTSD, natural disasters. For example, we're working with some of the folks out in Hawaii, especially as it relates to the people who survived the Maui fire. We also have talked to groups about things like the children and young people who survived conversion therapy in the LGBTQ community as well, who have PTSD. And so, like I said, there's a lot of communities that would overall benefit from this therapy.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think with climate change coming as it is, getting ahead of this is going to be very important because it's going to be a rough climate future. And I think, preparing psychologically, medically for this is going to be very helpful for everybody. So, yeah, thanks for that list, Charlie. Who are some of the interested parties in the VA or in the military around these potential therapies?
Well, we've worked with a number of great organizations that have really been present. There's several great groups. Charlie, you have the names I know off the top of your head. Why don't you list them? But they've been extremely helpful and engaged, making these issues a priority, organizing veterans, working in development with the VA in terms of giving them greater, I think, appreciation of the extent to which these therapies could be helpful. So we're very, very pleased. The traditional veterans organizations, once again, just as I experienced when I was in Congress, have really been reluctant to engage in many of these areas. But there's new groups and new organizations that I think have been particularly effective and vocal, and I think can really help lead the way.
Yeah, I think, as Senator Daschle said, I think some of the younger VSOs, I guess we can term them, that have veterans of a younger population. So like, for example, Disabled American Veterans, IAVA, have been really engaged on this issue. I know the American Legion and Wounded Warrior Foundation have come out in support. So I think the VA is moving in a better direction because of that outside pressure. I think also you have folks like the Undersecretary for Health and others that are personally interested in this as well. And I think where our focus on when the rubber meets the road is we work with VA clinicians who hear all these great things in public, but when actually go to apply for this grant money or try to do an investigate or initiate a trial, face a lot of roadblocks internally. And so our focus has really been on how we address those roadblocks that people face internally outside of what we see in a press release. When you talk about the military, I think, with the DoD funding that passed in the NDAA and in the appropriations bills, what we'll be keeping our eyes on is implementation. DoD didn't want that funding, but they did get it, as the power of the purse lies in Congress. And so it'll be interesting to see how that's implemented. We actually should have answers on that in the next, hopefully 1 to 3 months. The departments don't always meet the deadlines sent to them by Congress, but the bill gave them 6 months to figure out what a program would look like. Our focus will continue to be not only on the program is implemented, but how trial participants are treated. We're focusing on things like making sure those folks keep their rank, their role, and their security clearances, and their participation in a clinical trial at DoD doesn't lead to any form of discharge, whether it's other than honorable or a medical discharge. Just because right now, as most folks know, you can't be in the military and use what are considered illicit substances. And so we'll just be keeping an eye on that. Our hope is that since it's in a DoD clinical trial, those folks won't face any repercussions from that. But it is something we continue to keep an eye on. Like I said, just cautiously want to make sure that folks can get the care that they need without compromising their livelihood, especially since, the way you're discharged from the military certainly affects your VA benefits. And so, again, we just want to make sure people are getting the care that they need without compromising, their livelihood or any future benefits.
I would add something else too. I think it's really critical that we put as much attention and focus as we've already discussed on the VA. But this is really a broader issue than just veterans, of course. And I think engaging the DoD, engaging the Department of Health, other departments, other agencies. Obviously, we've talked about DEA. I think it's important for us also to elevate this issue as a health issue that goes way beyond just even the government. Working with the private sector to develop more of a private sector public-private partnership, I think is really important. Charlie and I, a few months ago, had a very good meeting with the Surgeon General, Surgeon General Murphy, and he seemed to be very supportive of the efforts to try to elevate this issue, recognizing how many different connotations and contexts there are, and how we need a much better and coordinated effort with a far greater universal approach to this than simply focused on a particular group of our people. Veterans are critical, and that can be the leading edge, as I've said, but there is a broader issue here, and we want to acknowledge that and try to expand it as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. Charlie, you brought up a really great point earlier about keeping clearance, right? Like a lot of folks are doing this and not necessarily reporting it back, and that's kind of a security issue, right? So I think once it's not just a healthcare issue, it's also a security and national security issue in a lot of ways, because a lot of key people have a lot of psychological distress. And if we can get ahead of that inside a legal, appropriate, safe context, that's of great advantage to the country. So I think that should be taken quite seriously. I'll let people's imaginations go with that one, but I that's one reason I've always had military on my mind.
Definitely. I think the last thing I'll add there too is I think we also want to make it so that the rollout of these therapies doesn't become some giant PR disaster. The headline kind of reads itself. If there were very unfortunately to be any accident on a base where involving, a soldier that was doing these clinical trials or, like that just becomes a PR nightmare that could possibly stifle a lot of the innovation and results there that also, again, you could have something, an accident happen in no way tied to someone's participation in a clinical trial that, the media or whoever would like to link to that. So like I said, we're just keeping an eye on these things. And again, we want folks to be healthy. We want folks to be safe, and just finding the best setting for that as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. One thing I was struck that you said earlier was even groups like the DAV are getting interested and quite active. I got to see one speak once, and it was really impressive. And I'm just heartened at the broad interest here. Even large hospital groups are interested. And I love Senator Daschle's idea of public-private partnerships because we could see a world in which these drugs are maybe so expensive that maybe the VA doesn't want to use certain drugs. And that would be a little bit of a travesty. But if we look at like total healthcare cost, I think we would see a radical decline in total costs across a large group of people. I think there's great correlations to lower intensities of psychological stress leading to better health outcomes overall. So we might see less heart attacks, even less strokes, less cancer maybe, which would be really helpful, I think, on the overall spend.
I'm a big believer in primary care and prevention. I think you can just go on and on with regard to the data and the stories, the statistics that point. I mean, we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, as you know, and in large measure, it is so expensive because it's so reactive. We wait until the emergency room, oftentimes, because insurance doesn't exist, primary care doesn't exist, and prevention doesn't exist. And so we end up paying at the high end of care for all of the many challenges that the American people face. That's especially true for mental health. And so I think putting greater emphasis on good primary care, good mental health primary care, greater prevention efforts, and more research could really do a lot to reduce the overall cost. We spend about almost $14,000 a year per capita, which is twice the cost of the second most expensive healthcare system in the world. And that should be unacceptable, especially when we're not getting the quality that that level of financial commitment should draw.
Yeah, I think the other aspect we look at, not only in terms of cost of care, but cost of R&D, that's where a lot of our work focuses on, not only how do we roll out this care, but how do we shorten the development timeline and reduce the costs for development. That's why one of the issues we work on is the Breakthrough Therapies Act, which would, once a drug receives a breakthrough therapy designation or is approved for expanded access, would be rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. It's not a decrim bill or anything like that. But we've talked to companies where that just drop down one schedule saves time and saves money, especially when you get into the phase 3 realm where you have multi-site clinical trials that you now no longer have to have, everyone on your team with a Schedule 1 research license in these special facilities. So I think there's both, regulatory fixes we can make to roll this care out, as well as that investment in those public-private partnerships on the rollout side. And I think all of those married together is the best way to make progress.
Yeah, I've been chatting about the scheduling system and how expensive and how much it slows research a lot over the last bunch of years. And I'm happy to hear there's some attention being given to this. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Breakthrough Therapies Act?
Sure. Yeah. So right now it's Congress's only bipartisan and bicameral psychedelics related bill, which we're very fortunate to have great leaders on both chambers. On the Senate side, it's led by Cory Booker, Rand Paul, one of the only Republican doctors in the Senate. And it also has the support of John Fetterman and John Bozeman. As folks may remember, John Fetterman had a stroke during his Senate campaign, and he heard about psychedelics that way. He had talked to his neurologist who had brought up psychedelics. It was an environment where he's like, their doctor's like, I can't do anything about this. Can't give you psychedelics, things like that. But, it's out there. Pennsylvania also has a very strong mushroom industry, looking to possibly do a new kind of mushroom industry. And then with Senator Bozeman, we're very thankful for his support as well. He's the lead Republican on the VA budget subcommittee. And so very much focused on how we roll this out in VA. On the House side, it's led by Madeline Dean, Nancy Mason, Marinette Miller-Meeks. Chairwoman Miller-Meeks is the head of the HVAC Health Subcommittee. So having her support is great. But we've built a really strong bipartisan coalition around the bill that provides a simple regulatory fix. The bill has gotten good feedback from DEA and other offices. We've got some of those conservative Republicans and most liberal Democrats, and a lot of folks in the middle too that are all like, yeah, like this bill costs $0 and would help a lot of people, especially a lot of researchers. And I think what drives a lot of people crazy is once they hear about these research barriers, they're like, well, that just makes no sense. Like, that doesn't happen here. And it's like, well, it does. Especially, the fastest we've seen one person get a Schedule 1 license is 11 months at UChicago. So the idea that we waited 11 months for paperwork, when we have, even just in the veteran community, upwards of 40 people commit suicide every day, we just can't be waiting around 11 months for a piece of paper. Right, especially at a respected institution like UChicago, and you have other folks like Harvard, Yale, University of Michigan, Ohio State, now in Indiana, possibly Purdue and the University of Indiana. These are all places that we trust to do any other kind of research, and they should be able to research psychedelics as well. Well, again, without all these onerous, often duplicative barriers, especially since the FDA is already reviewing these clinical trials to begin with. The idea that we then throw the DEA in there, I don't think is very helpful. Especially too when the definition of a Schedule 1 drug and the definition of a breakthrough therapy are direct opposites. A Schedule 1 drug is not safe, very addictive, and has no medical value. And the definition of a breakthrough therapy is safe for humans, no or low abuse potential, and more effective or more safe than anything on the commercial market for that indication. So it's just a clear miscommunication issue that we're looking to fix. Again, it's like a 5-word regulatory fix that'll help so many people.
A friend and ally, Wiz Buckley, who you all may have jumped into, he he likes to say, sounds a lot like alcohol and tobacco when we talk about the scheduling system. And when we look at that, we really do need to get more aligned with science and our actual definitions, right? And I loved your comment there about trying to get the DEA out of this whole drug development pipeline. The FDA should be able to handle that all on their own. And do you think this 11-month wait period was just slow bureaucracy? There's just no incentives to get these things passed, or do you have like a sense on what's going on there? Do we just need more staff?
I think it's a mix of a few different things. I think, again, you have an agency whose focus is the war on drugs. So they're not necessarily incentivized to keep rolling out Schedule 1 licenses and certifications. And I think where we continue to be, this is the same, so these research barriers are even going to affect folks at the VA wanting to do this research, right? So we're going to have government employees at the VA affected by another government agency trying to do this research. So I think it's a mix of things. I think part of it is also just duplicative bureaucracy, right? The FDA is obviously very involved in approving and signing off on any investigation or clinical trial. The idea that we need to throw the DEA into that process doesn't make a ton of sense. The bill too also, the rescheduling isn't automatic. DEA and HHS still need to make that decision, so it's not automatic, but still allows us to have that safety conversation and then reschedule. And I think we'll just continue to see more and more examples of when these drugs in the pipeline are safe, are effective, but are, again, continue to face barriers that if they were I say this a lot in meetings, if they were a breakthrough therapy for kidney disease or diabetes, would not be facing any of these same barriers. And so we just want to give all breakthrough therapies and great candidates that, like we've seen at Lykos and at Compass and at Cybin, the same level playing field that they would get, like I said, if they were treating another indication with a different drug.
Yeah, thanks for that. You said something earlier about Pennsylvania, and I'm really curious about this. We obviously know Pennsylvania has a gigantic agricultural mushroom industry. Have you heard things from constituents in Pennsylvania where they're actually interested in this?
Yeah, like I said, we've heard from Senator Fetterman's team. I think he even posted it about it on social media. That there is a mushroom industry in Pennsylvania, and depending on the regulatory environment, there could be another kind of mushroom industry in Pennsylvania. So we'll see what happens there. But I know it's something we've heard from their team.
That's fascinating. I'm aware of one company actually working with a lab to develop pharmacological, I guess, prescriptions that come from whole mushrooms, as opposed to like an isolated pure molecule, which I find really interesting. And I wonder if that could lower the barrier for patients, cheaper drugs.
Yeah, I think so. We've had this discussion, the natural versus synthetic conversation. And I think it becomes very hard to patent and schedule a botanical product. And it may not necessarily be a question if that's the right approach. It may more be a question, is our system ready for that? There's been a lot of conversation about, can you essentially patent psilocybin outright? What we've generally heard is the answer is no. That's why we're looking at, folks are patenting or getting approval for a specific molecule or an analog. And so the idea of necessarily patenting a whole mushroom, especially if it could be found in nature, could be very difficult, and I think lead to a lot of issues. But I do think you're right. It would obviously be a lot easier to distribute that way. But again, may not be something our system is ready for.
Right. Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation. I think there's some technical stuff there that we could get a patent lawyer to help us out on. But from what I understand, it's certain formulations. It's not even necessarily the mushroom or the molecule. Okay. It's like it has to look a certain way under a microscope. What do they call it? A certain crystalline form of psilocybin in the Compass Pathways instance. And yeah, similarly, I think there are some ways to productize the natural form, but you're not just going to get like mushrooms in a jar, right? It'll be some sort of productized thing, I believe.
Right. And that's some of the questions we've gotten on the Hill. Over the last 2 years, this issue has become a lot more understood. A lot less of our meetings are, those 101 intro educational meetings. But I've had a couple meetings where I went into a Republican office and they're like, "Oh, are you guys the mushroom guys?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know if we should be called that, but we are here to talk about that." And it's the same thing too. I mean, we've had questions about, does this mean my therapist is growing mushrooms in their office and giving them to patients? And, we tell them that is not the case. But I think that is somewhat sometimes people's impressions, whether it's based on what they've seen in the media or in, pop culture. But I think there's definitely, folks are definitely a lot more comfortable with the idea of, medication assisted therapy or medication administration with psychological support services, where you don't have the medicine leaving the doctor's office. And I think that's been a lot easier for folks to wrap their head around rather than, take home MDMA from CVS, especially because for a lot of people that pulls this issue very close to medical cannabis. And we work with a lot of Republicans who are like, I'm not pro cannabis, but I do support this issue. Because of just the astounding medical results that we've seen in clinical trials. And so the idea of, take-home medicine in this field just makes them feel very similar to medical cannabis, which some folks aren't supportive of.
I would just amplify what Charlie said. He's exactly right. I think I've been surprised. I'm probably the personification of the change in attitude and the change in support. Mine happened a long time ago, but it was an evolution. I was the victim in some ways of the information around the war on drugs, and it took me a while to evolve. That evolution, I think, is picking up speed. I think the level of support, the momentum behind these issues is far better now than it was 10 years ago. And I'm hopeful that we're going to continue to see the broad support that appears to be gaining ground. And as Charlie noted, we've been especially encouraged that in this hyper-polarized political environment that we're working under, it's a bipartisan issue. I'm real pleased that both Republicans and Democrats alike are increasingly supportive of the research and of broadening a better understanding. I think that's really critical. We're not there yet, but we've come a long way. Thanks to veterans groups, thanks to people like you, Joe, getting the word out, and a lot of hardworking people that really know that the time has come for us to make these changes.
Senator Daschle, I'm really curious about what kind of attitudes were you hearing from politicians, maybe even 5 years ago, about psychedelics? Would they just not even listen, or because I know people are far more receptive now, but what were you observing as resistance a few years ago?
Well, back in the day when the war on drugs was at its peak, you had Nancy Reagan saying, "Just say no," and that "just say no" attitude was directed towards cannabis. It was directed towards all the psychedelics, LSD, and so 5 years ago, Joe, I think people were still thinking of psychedelics in the LSD context, that it was the ultimate illustration of a Schedule I drug that you just didn't touch with an arm with a 10-foot pole. But slowly and gradually, thanks to research, thanks to greater attention, thanks to testimonies and documented evidence and real stories about human life and the health of many Americans, especially veterans, that perception has caught on. And I wouldn't say it's spreading rapidly, but it is certainly evolving faster than it did 5 years ago.
Mm. And are you seeing similar with cannabis policy as well, or opinions? Or is that still kind of stagnant?
We are. As you probably know, over half the states now have some kind of a cannabis policy. It has superseded the federal government. There are obviously a lot of different approaches. And in fact, we've been very active in support of something called the States Act, which gives the states total autonomy to decide its own cannabis policy. I think that makes a lot of sense. But we're seeing the same thing with cannabis as we are with psychedelics.
Hmm. I find it fascinating that we'll have different states with different positions even after the rescheduling. That'll be fascinating to see how that plays out. Um, but I think one impact of the recent notices of rescheduling or hope to reschedule maybe is there's more money coming in. And I think we might see similar in the instance of psychedelics as well. Like once there's more signals that this is good, more money will flow. And yeah, like to your point, Senator Daschle, we just had LSD receive breakthrough status as well. So we're at psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD at this point with breakthrough status, which is fascinating. And I think that's going to really help more innovation dollars coming in.
I agree. I think for all three, it's so critical. And that's something that you ask about 5 years. 5 years ago, that would have almost seemed impossible. But to me, it demonstrates the evolution and how quickly things are changing. And I emphasize, we're probably on the 20-yard line. We have a long way to go, but we're on the 20-yard line. And I'm encouraged by that because we were at the goal line a couple of years ago, and we're making progress. I think we're going to get to the 50-yard line certainly within the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think, as Senator Daschle said, the next 5 years I think will be crucial. If you look at things like the drug development pipeline maps that we see, right now we have, two candidates in phase 3. Well, we have the Lycos now in the NDEA process, but we also have COM360 in phase 3. The last time I checked, there's tons of substances in the pipeline, but 47 in phase 1 and 2. That 5 years from now will have hopefully at least gone up a phase. And this will continue to be an issue that regulators and Congress just can't ignore anymore. One of the things, too, we've heard is that, a majority of the substances that the FDA is looking at for psychiatric indications contain some form of psychedelic ingredient. And so even if Congress doesn't want to talk about it or regulators don't want to talk about it, they're dealing with it in their day-to-day and how they look at these substances. I think also when you look at, we've talked to folks kind of that hallucinogenic versus non-hallucinogenic pathway. We hear, pros and cons for both sides. We've heard from some folks that the hallucinogenic component is crucial to the healing process. And we've heard the opposite from folks as well. But I think if we can have a lot of different tools in our toolbox when a patient comes in and have multiple options for whether it's PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, major depressive disorder, or the wide range. I've seen things like smoking cessation, anorexia, alcoholism, smoking cessation. For some folks, the normal course of treatment we have now does just fine. For folks, they'll need more or they'll need something better. We just need to have those tools in our toolbox. We shouldn't have just one therapeutic option. We should have as many as we can, just like we do for any other indication.
Well said. Well said. I always use the analogy, would I really want my 95-year-old grandma to have a big psychedelic experience if she didn't have to? And the answer is no, I wouldn't. I would prefer she had something that was a lot easier for her in her final years, right? It's definitely compassionate to have this many tools in the toolkit. I think that's, it's in psychiatry, contemporary psychiatry has suffered because there's been very few new molecules that have been blockbusters, right? I remember Prozac being a big splash, but the data was a little iffy, 30 years later or whatever. And then here we are. Like this is the next big thing after like a Prozac or SSRI category.
No, it'll be great to see this week. I'll actually be speaking at the conference down in Mount Sinai on breakthrough therapies for addiction. And I think gatherings like that are a perfect example where, if we can see what works that are pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical options, again, just give folks the tools, give doctors the tools that they need to best treat patients. I've heard some of the doctors we've worked with that, practicing medicine is its own art form. It's not going to be the same thing for the same patient every single time. And we need to make sure we apply that to mental health just as much as we do physical health.
Yeah. I've been deep in the trenches on the chronic pain issue for 3-4 years now, working with my friend and colleague, Court Wing. We also recently became board members at the Psychedelics and Pain Association, where we're building a research map It's already available for free. It's every single study with some commentary that's ever been done, all the way back to, get this, pre-World War II, Germany was doing phantom limb pain research with mescaline. And then post-war in Japan, they were doing phantom limb research with LSD. And we had to finally unearth these papers, and things kind of went bananas after that. And there's so much great interest now with researchers and clinicians that it's sure to move the needle on the opioid topic.
That's
Definitely.
terrific. Really great.
Yeah, I like to get hyperbolic with it, and hopefully Purdue Pharma looks the other way. But I think there's a chance that we could reduce chronic opioid prescriptions by 80%. Just about every researcher and physician I tell the whole story to agrees. There's been one or two that disagree, which is good. But I think it's really hopeful to just think how many people's lives we could change, and not taking a daily pill. Maybe we do an intervention once every 4 years. That would be amazing. Versus, or maybe just once in their lifetime.
Absolutely.
Right? I think all of us probably know people with chronic pain.
There will be alternatives to opioids, and they can't come soon enough.
Right. I still want them to be around, opioids. I think they're fantastic in their right place, but for sure we need to evolve beyond that. Yeah, and there's so many interesting avenues. I'm sure you've heard the stories from football players or hockey players or even soldiers with brain injury. We're seeing more stuff. You shoot 1,000 rounds of mortar, you are getting these subconcussive traumas to your brain, and could come back with CTE. Get the PTSD diagnosis, and really you have brain trauma. Maybe you have both. But I think we could structurally really help people's brains and get them back to their families in a real meaningful way too.
I think that's where we'll see the role of things like ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT. That's kind of still a new issue on the Hill. I think there are a lot of, as also within the scientific community, there are a lot of concerns around ibogaine when it comes to the cardiotoxic effects. But that's why we have companies like Gilgamesh and others looking at safer versions. But I think that's a very real avenue when you're saying reducing prescriptions, but also looking, especially with Republicans, right? Republicans and Democrats, but a lot of Republicans have entered this issue because of the fentanyl crisis, and are saying, if you're telling me that, again, not tomorrow, but in a little bit, we'll have a real way to treat opioid use disorder or substance use disorder more generally, that isn't methadone or buprenorphine, they're willing to put aside stigma and cultural expectation or political expectations to get behind things. We saw, the effort in Kentucky didn't pan out as we hoped, but I think there was real potential there. And the NIDA grant to Gilgamesh, and then the deal they announced this morning, is also great progress. But as we continue to move forward, I think one of the ways that a lot of offices are thinking about it, that I framed it, is very similar to what we see as infusion therapy or chemotherapy for other conditions. You have those interventions that are spaced out, especially for infusion therapy, and that also, I think, changes the reimbursement conversation. A lot of those infusions are very expensive, but payers are like, okay, well, yeah, you're doing this once every 4 months, 6 months a year. That's okay. It's a little more expensive. And I think that changes the reimbursement conversation, especially if it means that we're not doing, one or more monthly prescriptions and weekly therapy appointments. I think the cost savings, and not only, there's the human benefit, but also the cost benefit analysis that I think is undeniable when it comes to how payers think about it. Payers aren't necessarily thinking about, how everyone feels about their decisions, but if we can make the numbers make sense for them too, I think that's really important.
Thanks. Two final things about risk. So the risks to this movement, I think, are kind of twofold, and I would love to hear what you two think on this. I think there's a real possibility of large cap pharma companies deploying a lot of capital to potentially lobby against these efforts in some interesting ways. I only suspected that I've seen it once or twice, largely around ketamine. I'm a little concerned there. And then the other part is a little bit of a lack of unity across the psychedelic organizations, which is complicated. I understand why there's a lack of unity, but I think if we had more unity, we could be a more solid voice and coalition working towards solutions. But I see a lot of behind the scenes stuff that's not really all that genial. Any thoughts on these two issues or other big risk factors?
I couldn't agree with you more, Joe. I think because we're still in somewhat of an embryonic stage with regard to the organizational effort, you can expect lack of cohesion. But you're absolutely right. When I served in the Congress, it was evident to me that those organizations that couldn't get their act together and stayed disorganized and had this cacophony of voices were not nearly as effective as those who really could unify and amplify as a result of that unification. So we need to unify and amplify if we're going to be successful. And I would hope over time that'll happen. I think it will. You asked about other risks. There's always also a risk of misinformation in the digital age, and I think we have to be concerned about misinformation. Charlie made a very good point earlier when he talked about how just one bad experience could be amplified and give the entire effort a bad reputation. We have to be concerned about that. But even if there isn't a bad event, even if there isn't an accident of some kind, we have to be concerned about dis and misinformation. And we've seen it on vaccinations in the last couple of years, which so tragically has affected millions of lives. And we don't want to see that here. We've dealt with misinformation around the war on drugs for too long. So we don't need a recurrence of misinformation. But that's always a threat as well.
Yeah, I think on the large cap pharma issue, I think what we've actually seen, or at least in my experience, again, except with those one or two instances, is actually largely the opposite. I've talked to a lot of companies, especially as, these larger companies have acquired smaller companies. There's a lot of interest. And I think folks, good, bad, or indifferent, see a lot of capital potential here. But my brain, as much as I don't want to think about it like that, I'm like, listen, if that's the investment that means people get access to care, like, willing to hold hands on that. On the Unity thing, I've been ringing that bell for a long time. Joe, we actually met you back in our office late last year. I was talking with another lobbyist in DC just about all the consternation and frustration with all the different groups in DC especially, and just like we're missing bites at the apple because we all can't get together and agree on something. And so back in January, we hosted 50 advocates from 27 different organizations at our office. We absorbed all the cost. And we're just like, listen, folks don't need to be best friends. They don't need to get drinks together, but like we all are on the same team, need to head in the same direction. Even if folks are pursuing different policy outcomes, we all don't need to subscribe to the same thing. I'm never going to say that. And there was a lot of reception. And I think there were a lot of folks in the room that aren't usually in the room together if they can make it that way. And we've seen some of the benefits from that since then. We've had a lot of conversations happen that I didn't think would happen. For example, talking with the American Psychological Association that attended and some other groups. And I think in DC, at least from our perspective, because that's what we handle is the federal level stuff. I think where there are chances for unity is this is within any advocacy group or any advocacy movement. There's a lot of ego at play sometimes. And folks want to be the group that succeeded, not necessarily that means the folks we're looking to serve succeeded. And so I think that's there. And I think also kind of the benefit of sometimes working with folks like Senator Daschle and I is we have folks who come on the Hill who aren't used to being in DC, or used to being in, for example, like a state legislature where you can go in with a bill and get it done in 6 months. And that's great that state legislatures work that way. I love that. I know that's why we've seen a lot of state funding for this issue. Unfortunately, that's not how DC works. It's how it should work, but that's not how it works. And so we've also seen some kind of pie in the sky attempts that kind of set folks back when you go in and you ask for something that, anyone from DC will tell you isn't feasible right now. That kind of slows down when we go into an office and ask for something a little bit more manageable. And I think also comes down to having folks find their right lane. I've talked about at length before. No one group or one person should have to shoulder the burden of an entire movement. And one group can't be a veterans group, a pharma group, a doctor group, and a patient group all at the same time, right? So we kind of need designated lanes for different groups in this space where, they're talking to different stakeholders, different members of Congress, again, all moving in the same direction, but maybe just from a different perspective. For example, for about 6 months, I worked with APA, the Association of the Psychedelic Practitioners Association, and we got meetings, for example, with both Democrats and Republicans that I couldn't get a veterans meeting with, but could get them a meeting with because they were doctors. And they're like, well, if there are doctors in the room, we'll listen to you, right? Because I think there's a lot of folks who view both the activist, patient, and veteran communities as folks who wanted access yesterday, versus, like, again, if there's a doctor in the room that I know will shoot straight with me, we'll have that discussion. Those are the voices we need. We need an array of voices, but they all kind of need to shoot at their own kind of communities and stakeholder groups on the Hill. Their folks can be a member of more than one advocacy community. I'm not saying they can't. But I think that's part of the unity that we need. And, we're happy to talk. I'll talk to anybody about this issue on the Hill. And we totally agree on the need for unity. One of the other things Senator Daschle and I work on is a healthcare coalition. And not only do we get patient groups on the coalition, but we also have manufacturers that day to day are competitors. We're talking about billions of dollars, in competition. But when it comes to what needs to be done in DC, they are all buddies and cheerleaders for the same set of goals. Because we can, we don't have to be best friends, but we can at least be on the same team and head in the right direction. And I think that's what the advocacy community in DC largely and very desperately needs.
Beautiful. Any topics we didn't catch that you'd like to make sure we capture here?
Oh, I think you covered the ground pretty well, Joe. I can't think of anything that I would add. Charlie, anything come to mind?
No, like I said, I think, like you said, Senator, I think this has been a great opportunity to chat and hope for future conversations. Like I said, our door is always open, whether it's to your team or other folks. We know DC is kind of a complicated place, so we're happy to talk to folks. And I think the next 6 months will give us a really good kind of outlook into what the next couple of years look like. Not only with what we see in legislation this year, like the NDAA and hopefully an end of year lame duck package, but also very much the outcome of the election will affect this issue. Folks, we are bipartisan. We always strive to be bipartisan, but depending on the party that's in power, the conversation is very different. So also how the next 6 months work out with the election and who controls what chamber of Congress or the White House will definitely affect the conversation for the next 2 to 4 years.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both. This has been amazing.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joe.